Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to another week of Islamic book reviews with myself, al-Azami, and our voracious reader, Dr. Omar Anchassi, beaming in from Riyadh in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and an associate fellow or a research fellow at the University of Exeter. It's always a pleasure to have you, Omar. And this week we're going to be talking about a third colleague and his book, Oliver Scharbrodt, and his book, Muhammad Abduh, Modern Islam and the Culture of Ambiguity. Is this out yet, or it's just about to be released, I believe?
I believe it's out, but I might be mistaken about that. Of course, one of the great advantages of having this show is we can get our hands on books before they become available to the general public. I believe it's out.
I'm just looking at the Bloomsbury. This is IB Taurus, of course, so Bloomsbury's website, and it says it's published on the 25th of this month. So we are giving people a sneak peek.
Advanced press.
So the usual format, Omar will be speaking about the book for about 10-15 minutes as a broad overview before we launch into a discussion of the book. And then we also welcome people's comments and their questions, and we'll try and address those in the last half hour or so of the presentation. So without further ado, Omar, I'd like to hand it over to you so that you can introduce the book.
Sure. Of course. Since Oliver is a colleague and hopefully a mutual friend of ours, I should say that he's a versatile scholar. I mean, he's worked on ethnography and intellectual history. I can't speak to the ethnographic dimension of his work since that's not my field, but this is a serious work of intellectual history. And it's divided into an introduction, 5 body chapters, and a conclusion. And it's really best understood or best approached as an intellectual biography of Muhammad Abduh. It's based on the author's PhD dissertation, the research for which he conducted some 20 years ago. So he's allowed it to stew for a number of years. And evidently there's a work of much reflection and has benefited, I think, and been enriched by this interval. And has then returned to it. And as the subtitle suggests, the kind of key intellectual framework with which the author approaches his reading of Abduh's texts in his life and career is Thomas Bauer's Culture of Ambiguity. To a lesser extent, he also draws on Shahab Ahmed's What is Islam? The Importance of Being Islamic. And as I say, this frames his approach. Some of the kind of key contributions of this book, the study of Abduh is kind of recentered by redressing an imbalance in previous scholarship, which tends to emphasize the last 15 years or so of Abduh's career. He dies in 1905, was born in 1849, when he produced works such as his Risalat al-Tawheed, published in 1897, based on lectures he gave at Al-Madrasa Sultaniya in Beirut, and also past scholarship to a great extent has also been heavily indebted to Rashid Rida, his disciple who dies in 1935, and his portrayal of Abduh in his 1931 Tarikh al-Ustad al-Imam, which is kind of the fundamental biography of Abduh. But of course, Rida seeks to align Abduh's views with his own, and presents him really as somebody who seeks to restore pristine Islam in all its purity. To use the term somewhat anachronistically, presents Abduh in a kind of Salafi light. Oliver, I should say, since we know him, does refer to the scholarship of Lauzier and points out that this term was not widely used in the period. In his most recent reflection on this question of terminology and the use of the term Salafi, in an article that Scharbrodt does not refer to because it's very recent, this is in the Journal of the American Oriental Society. Lauzier talks about the use of the term Salafi in Algeria in the 1920s, and this term in that context is used to people who have no particular interest or even hostility to the hadith literature. So obviously the term undergoes really significant development in the intervening decades. Anyway, now what Oliver is trying to do is really move the focus away from the later career of Abdu and attempts to kind of sanitize his presentation by Rida. I should say Tarikh al-Ustad al-Imam is a 3-volume work. The last volume to appear is actually the first one. If you look at the collection today, which is the actual biography of Abdu, an intellectual biography of Abdu in 1931. The other volumes kind of excerpt works of Abdu and discuss the praise of others for him and so on. Anyway, and also under Rida's auspices in 1940, well, posthumously as well, in 1947, the Tafsir al-Manar becomes available as an independent work. Of course, Rida dies in 1935. Anyway, now Oliver emphasizes both the continuities in Abdu's career and his intellectual program, if you like, and also redresses, as I say, the imbalance. Most scholarship has really neglected Abdu's earliest works, namely his 1874 Risala al-Waridat and his 1876 super commentary on Dawani's Sharh of al-Aqaid al-Adudiyya. Now, these works pose certain problems, not only in terms of authorship, but also in terms of content. So if you read these works, seemingly at least, they contrast quite radically with the fairly orthodox, at least according to a common reading, theology of Muhammad Abdu as presented in his Risalat al-Tawheed. Now, in his earlier work, I think Oliver has a paper that appeared in BSOAS in 2007 or something like this in the late 2000s, where he had argued that what really happens in Abdu is a kind of U-turn or pivot in his career away from this earlier stage. Now, that's one kind of fairly conventional view that he distances himself from in this book, which is, as I say, the fruit of many intervening years worth of reflection and reading. Now, why do these works present people with problems, particularly those who are committed to what Quentin Skinner has influentially termed the mythology of coherence? The idea that an author has a single intellectual agenda which they're kind of committed to, and any kind of difficulties must be explained away such that the author is kind of coherent and has a single program and so on. Now, there are problems with the authorship or questions about the authorship of these works. The late Muhammad Amara, whom I'm reminded by Oliver's book, died in 2020, rahimahullah. I'd forgotten about that. Who was edited in 5 volumes. The collected works of Abdu actually excludes the Risala al-Waridat and the super commentary on the Sharh from Abdu's collected works. He considers these to be works of Afghani, partly on stylistic reasons, partly because Abdu was quite young, in his early to mid 20s when these works were produced, whereas Amara considers them works of mature scholarship. And of course, I was involved, in taking dictation for these works. Oliver says there's actually better evidence for Afghani's authorship, namely in a work by Afghani's student Ibrahim al-Laqani, or in a letter by his student Ibrahim al-Laqani to Afghani. He refers to the Risala as your work, or a work of his authorship, and also in the Sharh, or in the super commentary on the Sharh, there are Persian words, of course, not a language that Abdu was familiar with. I should observe, or I should point out rather, that the super commentary on Dawani's Sharh of the Aqaid al-Adudiyya is now subject to this 3-year Templeton grant. So Robert Wisnowski and McGill, working with the great Walter Young, is producing a critical edition, including of the passages commented on by Abdu Afghani, since the authorship is really joint. I mean, this is the point that Scharbrodt is making, and it shouldn't be understood as a work of Afghani. It's more complex than that he suggests, and Abdu does certainly contribute in terms of content. Anyway, 3-year project to edit this work, translate it in its entirety, and also a volume of study. I think it was envisioned, at least, as a 4-volume work funded by the Templeton Foundation. It was a $250,000 grant, and that was actually due to finish 2 months ago in June. I should ask Walter perhaps to see how it's doing. But anyway, that's of course going to be a major contribution to the understanding of Abdu and his work, and it will help us appreciate the division of labor between them. Now, as I say, Oliver emphasizes Abdu's contribution, and Abdu also has another early work that seems to be lost, which is a treatise on Wahdat al-Wujud. It's a shame we no longer have that work, because it would tell us a lot. Perhaps we could extend this introduction, because I've only really touched the tip of the iceberg, because I've become quite interested in this question. Yeah, anyway. So these works are heavily influenced by intellectual traditions that Oliver says came to be marginalized in the Sunni world. To some extent, I disagree that these trends were marginalized. So what kind of, these works are really an outcome of the teaching circle of Afghani in Cairo. Afghani and Abdu first encounter each other in 1869 when Afghani is just passing through Cairo, but in 1871 he settles there. He starts teaching al-Azhar, but eventually that doesn't work out for various reasons. So he teaches people in some very influential circle of intelligentsia and social elites, Muslims and Christians, not just Muslims. And he teaches works like Ibn Sina's Isharat wa Tanbihat, Dawani's Risala's Zawra, Qutb al-Din al-Razi's Ayn al-Hikmah, Athir al-Din al-Abhari's Isagodzi, and works of this nature. And also Guizot, the French statesman, and his work translated into Arabic in 1878. History of, it's basically a kind of history of European civilization, which proves immensely influential on Abdu. And Oliver speculates that, 2 works that later became very important to Abdu may have been taught by Afghani in the circle, namely the Tahdhib al-Akhlaq of Miskawayh. Oliver refers to him as Ibn Miskawayh, but Miskawayh scholars have established that Miskawayh is the correct name. And also Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah. I doubt that these were taught, at least Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah, I would doubt these were taught by Afghani, because in the circles where he received his intellectual formation, these works were not important. Now, Afghani is known as Afghani, of course, but based on the publication of documents by Iranian scholars in 1963, it's long been established that Afghani was actually from Asadabad in Iran. He came from a scholarly Iranian family and studied also in Najaf, where he gravitated towards the Shaykhi school. And all of this plays an important role in Abdu's intellectual formation at Afghani's hands. But before turning to you and discussing the chapters in much more detail, I hope we have a long episode because this is a complex work. I want to say a bit more about the intellectual formation, the intellectual framework rather of the book, and then briefly discussing an outline of each of the chapters, which are for the most part chronologically organized according to the different stages of Abdu's intellectual career and life and so on. Anyway, the framework, as I say, leans more heavily on Bauer than Shihab Ahmed. I think Bauer is perhaps even worth a future episode. Bauer's contribution is a very important but also deeply frustrating one. Anyway, the kind of key point is that pre-modern Islamic intellectual culture had a far higher degree of tolerance for ambiguity and the reference to different and perhaps even competing registers of truth or regimes of knowledge. Shihab Ahmed instead refers to a kind of a public-private distinction and spatio-social organization that allowed for a kind of highly, you could say even segregated engagement with different Islamic discursive traditions. But anyway, what's the key contribution of Bauer? Muslims could entertain, almost competing truth claims in different fields of discourse, and that pre-modern Muslims were largely, comfortable with this degree of ambiguity and even contradiction. Now, this work, has gone on to influence Frank Griffel's recent book, which perhaps we can have an episode on. And it's really the key intellectual framework for Oliver in this book. Why? Because a number of commentators, including Albert Hourani, have commented on this kind of frustratingly complex, even contradictory and somewhat incoherent, project of Abdu. And especially when one bears in mind his early works, the Risale al-Waradat and the commentary, or the super commentary rather, on Dawani Sharh, this kind of really comes to the fore. Just to give an example from his commentary on, or super commentary on Dawani Sharh. Dawani's confessional identity is heavily debated. Ihab Badawi is the expert on this. In some works he defends the 12 Shia Imams, and he also attributed them as a work refuting 12ers. Anyway, that's another discussion, so I won't go into that. But in this work, at least, Dawani is, an Orthodox Ash'arite. I mean, I think Oliver suggests in one point that he's a Maturidi, which I haven't seen this before. It seems to be, anyway. So that's another discussion. But anyway, this work is a pretty, the work being commented on by Aduddin al-Iji, author of the famous Kitab al-Mawaqif. It's kind of standard later Kalam textbook. This is a fairly standard, kind of Ash'ari work. It actually contains anti-Shia elements as well. And what is why do we get the sense that Abdu's project, or at least his works, is somewhat inconsistent or even contradictory? For example, when the work refers to the hadith of the 73 sects, one of which is saved and the others, damned, what does Abdu say? He says that the differences between the mutakallimun and the falasifa are lafzi or semantic in nature, that the takfir of the philosophers is mistaken, that in fact, because they ground their doctrines in the Quran and Hadith, not just the falasifa, but in fact all of the major factions, Ash'ara, Mu'tazila, Shia and falasifa, that they are in fact all saved, and that the points on which they differ are not yaqini, or do not belong to the domain of ilm al-yaqeen or qat'i or apodictic knowledge, that these differences are excusable. Now, from the perspective of, shall we say, Orthodox Ash'arism, that of course is an extremely problematic set of claims. How do we account for this?
Any Orthodox Sunni sort of, so whether it's Ash'ari or others.
And I should say another intervention Oliver is making is to problematize in the first place this dichotomy between orthodoxy and heterodoxy, the secular and religious binary, and so on. Now, if I want to kind of characterize this book, Usama, just before I discuss the chapters very briefly and we turn to you, this is what's the major contribution of this work? It's a very serious, well-documented intellectual biography of Muhammad Abduh. And it's a really important contribution. I mean, you can't, I would strongly suggest anyone interested in especially modern Islamic thought, and it's also its relationship with the pre-modern heritage, should be reading this book. It's a very welcome contribution, and the author's erudition is in no doubt. Now, that said, the intellectual framing of the book did not quite persuade me. What do I mean by that? I mean, it's partly because, Bauer, who is a well-respected scholar of Arabic literature, who makes, I think, an important intervention in his book on the culture of ambiguity, which was only translated into English and published in 2021. The Arabic translation has been available for a number of years under the title Thaqafat al-Iltibas. I always felt iltibas is probably not the best word to use for ambiguity because it suggests actually like doubt and confusion rather than ambiguity anyway. And it has the kind of, it's quite a religiously freighted term. It actually, for me, suggests like almost religious doubt. Anyway, it's used in the Quran in this, in this sense, in some sense, laysa fi iltibas. But anyway, so why does the framing not convince me? It's actually, to some extent, it's more to do with Bauer than Oliver, because Bauer has a really interesting idea, which is not without merit, but his execution in the book is poor. When he strays from his expertise in Arabic literature, he makes many basic factual errors. He says in the preface to the English translation that, the 2006-2007 academic year is when he tried to kind of grasp all these other disciplines he didn't have a background in. And I think he needed more time to do this. Also, the English, based on the results, right? Also, the English translation, he says, corrects a number of mistakes in the German. So you can only imagine what was going on in the German edition. Anyway, Oliver, of course, reads the original German. So why also, so that's a very minor point. But why else is this framing that Abdu was socialized into this pre-modern culture of ambiguity, and that's how we account, we therefore do not need to account for the difficulties or ambiguities or even contradictions in his work. This is kind of a central claim of the book. In the first chapter, which is actually chapter 2, because the introduction is chapter 1, the book starts, or that chapter starts, by citing Fazl Rahman and his frustration with al-Ghazali, whom he says is really frustrating to read because he's so, it's very difficult to pin him down and so on. And then Oliver immediately says, this is, a symptom of this uncomfortable, or this, the way that modern authors find ambiguity uncomfortable in contrast to their pre-modern peers. Although actually, Oliver does, of course, go on to say that, well, Abdu is evidence of this, continued not only vitality of modern Islamic thought, but there is also still some kind of people still comfortable with some degree of ambiguity. Anyway, why is this a problem? Why is it mistaken, perhaps? And this is just a suggestion to say that Fazl Rahman is symptomatic of this modern condition, this lack of comfort with ambiguity, and that's why we've misunderstood, or previous scholarship has misapprehended Abdu and has wrongly, has unjustifiably failed to understand the nature of the contradictions or tensions perhaps in his project. because this is, this exact claim of contradiction is one that Ghazali's pre-modern readers make of him, and one they're evidently uncomfortable with, whether it's Ibn Rushd or Ibn Taymiyyah or other readers. So for almost a millennium, pre-modern Muslims were saying, in the same century and subsequent centuries as Ghazali's death, and even his students like Ibn al-Arabi, the Qadi, are aware of this contradiction. If their contemporaries, roughly speaking, or die in the same century or in later centuries of Ghazali, presumably they're also socialized into this culture that's comfortable with ambiguity. So, there's a fundamental contradiction here. If we're trying to explain the tensions or even contradictions in Ghazali's thought with reference to a supposed pre-modern culture of ambiguity, how do we account for the fact that Ghazali's pre-modern readers also were frustrated with his contradictions? By the way, there's something Fazl Rahman actually cites directly. He's drawing on them. Of course, he's reading Ghazali himself and he's experiencing this frustration firsthand. But he cites directly, Ibn Rushd saying that, he's a philosopher with the philosophers and, a theologian with the theologians and so on. Now, similarly, Abdu's readers and peers, whether it's Rashid Rida, who refers to Wujub al-Kitman in the discussion of Abdu's career, saying also that he's a jurist with the jurist and a philosopher with the philosophers, they're also aware of this, the kind of tension in Abdu's work. Now, if that's true of Ghazali, and his pre-modern readers, it can only be more true of Abdu, one can suggest. So anyway, one can take issues with the framing and particularly the reference to Bauer. Nonetheless, even if one dispenses entirely with Bauer, and I don't think it's necessary to do so, I do think there is something to the thesis that pre-modern Muslims were comfortable to a greater degree than their modern descendants with ambiguity. I just think Bauer doesn't do a very good job of demonstrating it, even if there is something, there's analysis. But this is still a very solid and well-documented intellectual biography. And the framing, the framing you can kind of contest. But anyway, before quickly going over the chapters, I think Oliver really succeeds in demonstrating the continuities in Abdu's intellectual biography. The way that even in later works like Risalat al-Tawheed, for example, his prophetology is still clearly very Avicennan, and it's also influenced by these other elements like Yuzo and Ibn Khaldun and so on. Anyway, briefly to account for the chapter. So the introduction, yeah.
Sorry, keep on going. I'll ask the question in the course of the discussion.
Sure. So the chapters, as I say, intro, 5 body chapters plus conclusion. The intro kind of sets up the framework and discusses some of the points I've raised. The first chapter looks at Abdu and his intellectual formation, his discipleship with Afghani, and in an 1883 letter that Rida anxiously suppresses, you get a sense of how close Afghani and Abdu were. There's a kind of Sufi, Murid, Sheikh relationship going on there. And why perhaps was Rida interested in suppressing this letter? Because Abdu refers to Afghani in quasi-divine terms, as Oliver says, using Quranic diction. Of course, there's a very Sufi thing. He's not referring to him as God or anything. So, he refers to him as the one who created me with his hands, bi-ahsani taqweem as well, and so on and so forth. And it says that he's following his sunnah. So clearly they were very close. Of course, they were falling out in the 1890s, which we'll return to later in the episode. So his scholarly formation under Afghani until the Arabi Bey, his scholarly formation under Afghani. The third chapter, which is actually the second body chapter, if that makes sense, continues a discussion of Abdu and his public life in Egypt from the 1870s onwards, including his early journalism, which takes place with with the support of Abdu, of Afghani, who had a number of disciples who were, important journalists, setting up newspapers like Misr and so on. And Abdu in his early journalism discusses social issues like polygyny and politics to some extent, and becomes in 1879 co-editor of al-Waqa'i al-Misriya, the kind of official gazette of the Egyptian government. Anyway, and that third or second body chapter continues until Aurabi Bey and his 1881 revolt, or however you wish to characterize it. And Abdu, who supports this action, is exiled in 1882. The fourth chapter, so again, to clarify, fourth chapter equals third body chapter, but I'll just refer to the number the chapter is actually given in the book from now on, explores Abdu in exile. He is in exile from 1882 to 1888, at first in Beirut, but he hooks up with Afghani in 1884 in Paris, where they jointly publish al-Urwat al-Wuthqa, and they found a secret society by that name, and the journal is named, in fact, after the secret society. There are only a few numbers published. In 1884, Abdu goes to Tunis in an effort to raise funds, and that doesn't really work out. Rida suggests this is where a kind of parting of the ways between Abdu and Afghani sort of begins, although it only really emerges in a concrete way in the 1890s anyway. And he returns to Egypt in 1888. He's in Beirut, I should say, Abdu, from 1895 to 1888. Sorry, 1885 to 1888. He returns to Egypt in 1888. Is kind of given a qadiship in the provinces by Khedive Tawfiq, who is not really happy with him. And Khedive Tawfiq is pressured by the British and one-time Prime Minister Riyad Pasha, and as well as supporters in court, to accept Abdu's return to Egypt in 1888. But because of Tawfiq's dislike, he does not return to public life until 1892. The next chapter explores Abdu's kind of return to public life. In particular, he has a very important position in the council responsible for reforming al-Azhar, Majlis Idarat al-Azhar, the administrative council, and in 1899 becomes Mufti at Diyar al-Misriya. A post that is created in 1899, along with the Sheikh al-Azhar. These are distinct posts. Anyway, he returns to public life in 1892 because Khedive Tawfiq dies and is replaced by Abbas Hilmi II, with whom Abdu initially has quite a fruitful relationship, but it deteriorates because of all kinds of personal conflict. And the final straw is when Abbas Hilmi II tries to exchange some of his land, some of his estates, for more lucrative waqf property, which Abdu blocks. So there's they've kind of fallen out anyway. The next chapter, chapter 5, explores the kind of major works produced in Abdu's last 15 years, especially his Tafsir Juz' Amma, which Rida says at this period at least is his most popular work, and also his Risalat al-Tawheed, which comes out in 1897. The Risala al-Waridat is actually published in 1904 to Rida's chagrin, and Abdu actually, confirms his authorship of the work. So that's very interesting when reflecting on Abdu's legacy. And the final chapter, or the concluding chapter, the conclusion, in fact, is about Abdu's legacy and the contradictions and tensions therein are explained in terms of this intellectual framework of Bauer, a kind of Abdu's being socialized into in his comfort and equanimity with this culture of ambiguity, which had a high tolerance for contradiction and so on. But he explores, as I think we've discussed with Sam in a previous episode, the fact that Abdu has these kind of starkly divergent legacies is manifested in his students, those who become involved in Hizb al-Ummah, this kind of liberal, secular political outfit, people like Ahmed Lutfi Sayyid, And figures like Saad Zaghloul, who becomes involved in the Wafd and nationalist politics, himself an Azhari, pardon me, but actually in his capacity as a nationalist is really rather secular individual, and figures like Rida, who, especially from the 1920s onwards, increasingly gravitates towards Wahhabism and Abdulaziz bin Saud. And even though he only moves to Cairo in 1898 and therefore spends much less time with Abdu than figures like Saad Zaghloul, who'd known him for much longer, by virtue of the relatively early deaths of some of Abdu's other disciples, and the fact that, like Saad Zaghloul, they become preoccupied with politics. By virtue of that, and also, of course, Rida's various interventions, Rida becomes kind of the custodian of his legacy. He is the one who writes the major biography in 1931. I mean, that biographical volume of the 3-volume work. And in the 1930s, there is a kind of, having previously been neglected in biographical terms after Rida, and especially from a 1936 attempt to kind of reform al-Azhar and a search for legitimacy in previous attempts to reform it. There are kind of 3 other biographies of Abdu that come out by Abdul Mun'im Hamada, not Ahmed, I mean, and one of his sons, and also by Mustafa Abdul Raziq. Anyway, so scholars have all too often, Oliver says, kind of interpreted Abdu through this lens, neglecting his earlier work, and where they have addressed it, misunderstanding it, because of this lack of intellectual framework produced by Bauer, the Culture of Ambiguity, and so on. So this is a kind of revisionist work, if you like. And even where one disagrees with elements of it, I think it's a very important contribution, very lucidly presented, and well documented. So I enjoyed reading it as well. I mean, it has to be quite a good piece of writing for me to enjoy reading it so much. So that's hopefully an outline and some of the major themes that crop up in this work.
Jazakumullah khair, Omar. I think you've offered now basically anyone who wants a primer on Oliver's book can basically look up the first half hour of this recording, or actually, I mean, close to around 35 minutes, shall we say. So Jazakumullah khairan for that, and I guess we can launch into a discussion. Oliver is a friend of both of ours, a colleague, more senior colleague. He's obviously a full professor, but he's also someone who's acted as an advisor, in the project of the British Association for Islamic Studies that we were both involved in. I continue to be involved in.
I mean, so, I should say as well, he's played a key role in more than one Embrace conference. Absolutely. And really took the lead in the Brace conference that happened at Exeter. And I was involved, so I remember how actively involved he was. 2016.
So we had the Chester conference, I believe he would have been quite engaged in, but that was before I had formally joined Brace as well.
Yeah. And Exeter as well. I mean, he was heavily involved in both of these. And I should say, finally, I mean, he's played a major role in the revival of Birmingham's fortunes as a very important center of Islamic studies. After the 1980s, it went into decline somewhat. And it really kind of picked up when Oliver was there in a major way, because he had this very big ESRC grant, which brought a lot of PhD students and postdocs to Birmingham, a number of whom, my colleagues and, mutual friends. And I hope, and he then moved to Lund in Sweden, presumably because they made an offer he couldn't refuse. But hopefully he returns to the UK soon, because really, as well as being, an outstanding scholar, and one of these scholars who's very good at generating opportunities for younger or early career scholars by virtue of big grants. In terms of his involvement in Brace, has also contributed something very important, I think, to British Islamic studies. So we hope he returns soon to the UK.
And not far off. I mean, the English Channel is a very short sort of distance to travel. So hopefully we will see much of him in any case. So I wanted to actually, I mean, I also have had the pleasure of him, he and a colleague of ours at King's, Omar Anchassi, whose work I also admire, were both editors of a special issue journal where they sort of published one of my articles. So I'm very grateful for that. That was on sovereignty. Although we had some very interesting, because they both kindly invited me to a workshop at King's College on Maududi in 2019. And with actually Qasim Zaman, so one of my doctoral committee members. We had some very interesting and engaging exchanges at the workshop, after the workshop. And I actually sort of, in light of, I unfortunately haven't had the opportunity to read his book yet, but I most certainly will in the near future. In light of what you've kind of outlined, I think it explains, in a sense, a perspectival difference that I experienced with himself and Humaira, and to a certain extent Qasim as well, in terms of thinking about the culture of ambiguity, shall we say, within Islam. So just as an example, Qasim was just mentioning in passing, after I highlighted the nomocratic sort of attitudes of the ulama in general. So law is actually quite sort of central to their discourses. And
the notion that law must be derived from revelation, right?
So yes, I mean, my article in particular is focused on sovereignty, and sovereignty as being sort of a sourcing normativity from revelation on some level. And Qasim was highlighting how, and I think Shah Waliullah still needs to be studied because he's such a vast character. But he was highlighting that in his Sufi writings, he seems to go down an antinomian path in some passages, like quite literally saying that, at-taklif yurfa, these are Persian passages, I believe, or possibly Arabic. So this is something which is, I think, referenced by Ahmed Shamsi in one of his footnotes at some point. In
I mean, it's Shah Waliullah is actually a good case study of this culture of ambiguity.
Absolutely.
And his legacy is appropriated and claimed by Brelwi's Deobandis Ahli Hadith.
Yes.
I mean, not unlike Abdu, who is claimed by Islamist movements and liberal, secular, modernist.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and feminists and all the rest of it. I mean, or what would be considered feminists of the time, I suppose. I mean, I think at the same time, my sort of disagreement with Qasim in particular in that particular conversation was that, well, actually, what's going on here is, why is it that we choose to emphasize the ambiguity in these sorts of moments? And I think that there's a broader sociological question about the study of Islam that needs to be taking place. So one example that I can give, which homes in on Thomas Bauer, and apologies, this is more of a commentary almost than a question, but hopefully I'll get to some questions, and please feel free to interject in the course of my discussion as well. I haven't finished reading Bauer's book, actually. I'm ashamed to say. It was also because, to a certain extent, I became weary towards the sort of final third that, can I push towards the very end? Because
I can relate to that, I'm afraid.
Oh, indeed. Okay, so you've not finished reading it.
Quite the wariness. I mean,
so let me just share a comment. I mean, it's been a while since I read it. I think I read it a couple of years ago now, or maybe a year and a half ago. But here's a comment I sent someone on a WhatsApp group. And I said, now that I'm more fully reading Thomas Bauer's The Culture of Ambiguity in English, I had only read sections of it in the German. I'm finding it quite remarkably wanting in embracing the ambiguity it celebrates so much. I'm reading chapter 5 now and feel as though chapter 4 was the only one I've benefited from so far. Now, let me give a specific example. This is the final thing I say about this. When I read a statement like, quote, Ibn Kathir was one of the most narrow-minded bigots in intellectual history of Islam, I find myself wondering, end quote, I find myself wondering, who is the bigot here, right? And so...
Yeah, I should say, that reminds me very strongly, although he doesn't use such forceful language of, Calder has a famous article on tafsir as a genre, where he doesn't call him a bigot, but he says Ibn Kathir is like, insists on finding just one correct meaning in every verse, and this makes God out to be so uncreative, and this kind of things. And he's evidently not sympathetic to his project. But then, if that's the case, then Ibn Kathir clearly rejected this culture of ambiguity. One can find, at the very least, one can find so many counterexamples to the culture of ambiguity thesis, let alone, the kind of problems with the examples he gives themselves. But that's, I think we should kind of park Bauer to one side in the interest of fairness.
But I don't want to dismiss. The thing is, I read Bauer and highlighting all of these dimensions of our tradition. I think of someone like Imam al-Dhahabi, who, is, his relationship with Ibn Taymiyyah led him to be criticized by everyone, basically. So, and he complained about it as well. He said, "I'm disliked by his admirers and his haters," because I have a sort of like...
Dhahabi, by the way, is one of the most fair-minded, historians in Islam. As far as I'm concerned.
I agree. He's got, as Christopher Melcher would say, like he has also a great eye for picking up inconsistencies, like in narratives and things like that. But I guess the reason I mention him is, it just reminds me of, I was reading his biography in Sir Alam Nubala of Qais ibn Mulawah, right? What's his name? Majnun Layla. And it's like, he has this discussion of him, a historical discussion, and then he's like, and then, scholars disagree of whether he existed or not. But who cares? Look at his poetry. And then he goes, because he's got a good poetic sensibility at the Dhahabi, and he then produced beautiful lines.
Again, on the culture of ambiguity, I don't want to be unfair to Oliver by talking about Bauer too much, but when reading the book, I thought of all kinds of examples. So, Afghani himself practices taqiyya, right? Never, at least as far as I can tell, never announces in Egypt that he's actually of Shia background and from Asadabad, not Afghanistan. Would pre-modern intellectuals have viewed this as, an intolerable ambiguity? It's not an ambiguity, right? It's just an outright. I think they would have. So, Shahid al-Awwal, the famous Shia faqih and author of the Lum'a Dimashqiyya, who was executed in 1385, mixing with Sunni. Sorry?
1385 in the Common Era.
Yeah.
I don't know this figure.
So he's accused of rafta, that's how the charge is framed, and insulting the companions and Aisha and so on, and kind of concealing his Shiite commitments, basically. Now, there was confessional ambiguity in, the Islamic middle period. So you do get, just an example, since yesterday was Ashura, because it's now after Maghrib. This is the 11th of Shahrullah Muharram. Anyway, Ihab Badawi has mentioned this, the whole reason Rosa Khanis are called Rosa Khanis is because of this work, Rawdat al-Shuhada, by a Sunni Naqshbandi author, Va'iz Ikasifi, who wrote a really influential kind of Rosa Khani text.
Right.
And he kind of acknowledges the 12 Imams for esoteric reasons and so on, and yet he was a Sunni Naqshbandi. Now, you do get a lot of that, especially in what Europeanists would call the early modern period. So, it's not that one rule applies consistently across the whole scope of Islamic history and even geographically, but, I think this idea of the culture of ambiguity, it's not without merit, but it needs heavy qualification. And I don't think, in all honesty, Bauer was the best person to write this book. I think actually Sheikh Ahmed would have done a better job of it. And of course, his book is more ambitious in scope. He's engaging with the conceptualization of Islam as an historical phenomenon itself, which is much kind of broader claim, although the work's interrelated, as you pointed out. Anyway.
So just to conclude on sort of just a concluding point, Ahmed Shamsi adds about, in its worst moments, Bauer's book is a version of the good Muslim, bad Muslim dichotomy. And I agree with that, but I also think I think this heuristic of ambiguity is actually, it can be very useful. So I hope someone draws on it. And I'm sure, Oliver in that way will draw on it, and more of us as scholars can draw on. Because one of the things that I always love to say to students, for example, and to colleagues when I get the chance, is that, look, I even within Islam, the various ulum shar'iyya sometimes pull you in different directions, and those sensibilities are all sort of like mishmashed in my own sort of like makeup. And
I mean, one thing that Bauer does well, for example, so in a course I taught at Edinburgh on gender, I would always bring up Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, who writes homoerotic poetry, with pederastic themes, and yet was this extremely distinguished scholar of hadith among other disciplines. But I think there are ways we can account for that even without even mentioning ambiguity. But it's a helpful framework.
Right.
It's just the execution isn't great. I think that's my major gripe, but still a useful work.
Just for non-specialists, when we speak of someone like Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani writing homoerotic poetry, these are tropes that are widespread in the writing of those genres. So, he would be the first to say that obviously, practicing sodomy and things like that are haram and so on. So, but that ambiguity is lacking in, the popular consciousness today. I assume actually, very often people in the popular consciousness, it would also be perhaps lacking for a lot of people in the past as well.
But no, I mean, even beyond the popular consciousness, because, Joseph Mes'had discusses this in Desiring Arabs, also Khalid Arwai been for homosexuality. I mean, even the scholarly editors of these works feel discomfort and try to kind of either reinterpret them or Baudelarize these texts and so on.
So just to shift gears, I mean, this is again, as you say, Bauer's sort of framework is it's in the subtitle of the book. So we're going to constantly be coming back to it, but I want to focus on sort of an element of this which comes out in what you've said in discussing Oliver's book. So the idea of contradictions being sort of just sitting there and not having to be reconciled. I wonder, like, how frequently do we find this in a form that you would recognize as really, embracing contradiction in a sense in Islamic culture? When I think about, I mean, contradiction by itself is kind of problematic in the sense that someone like Alistair McIntyre in his Whose Justice for Rationality, towards the beginning, he basically says, well, if you're not going to affirm that contradiction is problematic, then there's no point even talking to you, right? I mean, if you can affirm and do the same thing, you can't even have with an individual.
It might be more productive to speak of tensions, but I mean, with fairness to Oliver, some of the things he mentions cannot be regarded as contradictions. I mean,
right.
I mean, how can you defend how can you claim, how can you be seen as an Orthodox Ash'arite on the one hand, and on the other, to say that the differences between the mutakallimun and the falasifa are semantic? You can't really entertain both of these. It's like the law of non-contradiction, right? This basic premise of logic. Actually, that's another, maybe one could say there's a counterexample to the culture of ambiguity, right? This kind of idea that, you cannot be one thing and the opposite thing at the same time.
Yes.
So anyway, but I think let's just stop talking about Bauer, because I feel like I've discussed the book itself.
So I'm not talking about Bauer so much here. I'm thinking in the case of like applying that in this broader sort of canvas. When Abdu is asserting maybe these different positions, I do wonder if we are better served by adopting a perspective which says that actually we can have kind of siloed disciplines to a certain extent where those different perspectives. So,
and this came up in our episode on Omar Anchassi's book, when talking about al-Mawardi, for example. I mean, Oliver says there are two kind of main mechanisms or strategies people have resorted to for minimizing these tensions in Abdu's thought. One is to posit evolution or kind of development. That's how Melcher explains these kind of tensions in Mawardi, for example. And that's the earlier approach Oliver used in his BSOAS article. And the other approach is to look at the problematic texts and doubt their authorship, right? Now, I think defensively, in both of these instances, Oliver says, look, actually, neither of these explanations are that convincing in Abdu's case. We have to find another way of explaining what's going on here. And that's the point where he kind of reaches for the culture of ambiguity. So, I think that's really well done.
Yeah.
There are these problems. We do have to account for them or not account for them, as Bauer suggests, in a sense. And that's really well done.
I always think about the tension that one finds within Orthodox Islam, Sunni Islam, so to speak, post Ghazali, where sort of the Sufi sort of synthesis has taken place, you could argue. The history is, of course, more complex than that.
Yeah.
But
that's actually a great example, right, of the culture of ambiguity, because Sufism is a separate register where you can say things that aren't tolerable in other domains of discourse.
So, I really like, just on a personal level, like William Chittick's Sufism, A Beginner's Guide. And, it's full of poetry and it's beautifully written, mashallah. But, when you read some of the Sufi poetry, if you read it in a literal-minded fashion, it can be blasphemous. But that's not the point.
Yeah.
It's just not the point. And you're missing the point.
But again, the thesis needs qualification, because there were people who are uncomfortable with this. Whether it's as early as Ghulam Khalil and his persecution of the Sufis for using the language of ishq, passionate love, to refer to God. So, you can always find examples of people who are uncomfortable with this and who insisted, no, there has to be a unitary standard for what's acceptable and what's not acceptable when talking about God. So again, interesting idea, but needs more work. But I want to say more about Oliver and Abdu.
Yeah.
And there's a great deal to be said. So, again, you find important kind of idea in the book is the continuity of themes. And all kinds of things one can say. So,
one issue that you raised early on, which I was just curious about, is Abdu's relationship with Orthodoxy. And we have kind of touched on elements of this before. But I just wanted to clarify a little more, particularly in relation to his relationship with Afghani, because was he aware of Afghani's sort of genealogy or his background? And
I don't think we'll ever know, to be honest.
Okay.
Because Afghani was just incredibly compelling. That would make a great Hollywood movie, a biopic. Afghani.
Right.
Why? Because he's inclined to this Shaykhism movement of Ahmed al-Ahsa'i, dies 1826, succeeded in that regard by Khadim Rashti, who dies in 1843.
Right.
And Sheikhism, from which Babism and later Baha'ism emerged, being this intellectual synthesis of, Avicennan philosophy, Hikmati Ishraq, this kind of Suhrawardian illuminationism, Ibn Arabi and these Akbarian tendencies and so on. And, because Afghani himself undergoes a kind of Ghazali-esque spiritual crisis in his early years, Oliver points out.
Right.
And, he kind of finds relief from this in Sheikhism. And he's rebuked for some of his interests by his fellow students in Najaf and so on. But why is, and Oliver demonstrates why this formation of Afghani is significant to Abdu's later career, because drawing on Mullah Sadra and others, and I don't want to embarrass myself by discussing Mullah Sadra, a scholar who I'm not, I haven't spent time with really. But Ahmed al-Ahsa'i has this notion of al-Shi'i al-Kamil, the perfect Shi'i who, like the Imams, kinds of spells out the Batini aspects of revelation. Interestingly, Rida actually refers to Afghani in terms of Batinism. He uses this term.
Was Rida aware of Afghani's sort of
his Shi'i background? No, I'm pretty sure he wasn't. But Afghani. So anyway, this perfect Shi'i figure is meant to enunciate these Batini aspects of revelation or dimensions of revelation. And although Qadim Rushdie, for example, would acknowledge that the Quran is the final revelation, its expression or its understanding is subject to a kind of evolution or development, and the Shi'i al-Kamil plays a role in articulating this.
Right.
Now, Rida frames both Afghani and Abdu as mujaddids. So he's also, to a lesser extent, sanitizing Afghani. Now, Afghani was this very compelling figure, and ultimately, one kind of key explanation for why he falls out with Abdu is, when Abdu returns to Egypt, partly because the British pressure Khadir Tawfiq to allow him to return. Eventually, he throws in his lot with Cromer, and with whom he enjoys a close relationship. Cromer dying in 1917.
Right.
Cromer the bastard, as we referred to him in an earlier episode. Pardon my French. Abdu kind of moves away from his earlier activism inspired by Afghani, and later comes to feel that actually Muslims are in need of colonial tutelage, at least to the extent that they can use the colonial powers to advance an agenda of reform. And in fact, it's Cromer who allows him, against the Khadif, to pass some of his administrative reforms to al-Azhar, including his administration of waqf, interventions, and also, Abdu sets up a library for al-Azhar, as Ahmed al-Shamsi has discussed in his book. He establishes regular salaries for mosque staff in Egypt, centralizes mosque administration. He makes limited interventions in the Azhari curriculum, introducing the instruction of geometry, arithmetic, and history, and so on, but has fairly limited success otherwise in changing the curriculum. Does try to emphasize instruction in primary texts as opposed to commentaries. But he's able to enact many of these reforms only with Cromer's support. In 1899, Oliver suggests he accepts the post of Mufti Diyar al-Masriya, but somewhat reluctantly. And in the last, extant correspondence we have between Afghani and Abdu, Afghani charges Abdu with cowardice, whereas in Rida's account, at least, Abdu felt that Afghani had wasted his considerable talents on political intrigue. He's exiled from Egypt, Afghani, in 1879 because, he tries to get involved in attempts through kind of Freemasonic networks. Afghani becoming a Freemason in 1875, becoming the head of the Star of the East Freemasonic Lodge. And Freemasonry is something we can discuss as well, because, we find out in 1905 from articles by Rida that, of course, Abdu himself becomes a Freemason at one point. Anyway, he tries to mobilize.
Is that published in the Manab?
Afghani tries to mobilize these Freemasonic networks, which straddle confessional boundaries, as he himself does in his teaching circle, to kind of at first have Khedive Ismail assassinated. Ismail steps down in 1879, and then he intrigues against Tawfiq, who replaces him, and he gets thrown out. And everywhere he goes, Afghani causes trouble.
I'm intrigued. I was unaware that he was effectively attempting instigation of, the murder of the ruler or something along those lines.
One of his disciples assassinated the Qajar ruler.
What did Abdu think about that dimension of this?
Oliver suggests. Yeah, so really, already in 1879, even though, of course, they meet up in Paris and collaborate on al-Urwat al-Wuthqa, which is, a publication that stresses pan-Islamic unity and, tries to mobilize Muslims against European imperialism. Although Paris is probably not the best place to mobilize Muslims against European imperialism. It's been suggested elsewhere that Afghani's anti-imperialism was directed against the British and wasn't a more general campaign, but that's kind of controversial anyway. The French clearly were aware of what he was doing, must have been using him as a pawn against the British to some extent, otherwise they wouldn't have allowed him to operate anyway. In 1879, when Abdu accepts a post initially as co-editor and later becoming full editor of al-Waqa'il al-Masriya, he's sort of, to some extent, ambivalent about the revolutionary project. He endorses Riyad Pasha's reform program. Riyad Pasha becomes prime minister, and initially is cautiously supportive of Urabi Bey's revolt. Urabi Bey is an Egyptian military. I won't discuss the background. Hopefully, it's well known to people, and I don't want to be diverted too much. Urabi Bey is a good native Egyptian stock. Reaches the highest rank in the military, that is colonel, that native Egyptians are allowed to reach, and like other Egyptian officers is frustrated by the kind of hegemony of the Turco-Circassian elite in Egypt who dominate the upper ranks of the military and the bureaucracy and so on. Anyway,
right.
But he and his fellow officers present themselves as tribunes of the people and insist that the Majlis al-Nawab that Ismail had established in 1866 be reinstated. It was kind of not really a parliament, more an advisory body that had limited oversight anyway. In 1882, so he's successful, Arabi. In 1882, he becomes Minister of War, and a basic law is enacted which gives the Majlis al-Nawab oversight over the budget. The British, are not very happy about this and use anti-foreign riots in Alexandria in June of 1882 as a pretext to intervene, and that's when the British occupation of Egypt, begins. In 1882, they bombard Alexandria and so on, and from that point on, Egypt had kind of been bankrupted in 1876, so it failed to keep up repayments on its loans and defaulted. So it had already been kind of subject to British and French intervention from especially from 1876 onwards. But in 1882, it's basically a British protectorate. Directly. Now, Abdu kind of falls in with this. Now, he is supportive of Urabi. Later on in life, he tries to suggest that actually I'd been skeptical about Urabi all along, and that I didn't think he was really committed to representative government and so on. But a letter of February 1883, so fairly close to the events, not long after Arabi is defeated, suggests that Abdu actually regarded the revolution, if you like, as a fruit of Afghani's agitation, and certainly Cromer and Wilfred Scowen Blunt, who dies in 1922, this kind of Arabophile British aristocrat, who was an important source on the period and a close friend of an associate of Abdu. Both Cromer and Blunt do regard Abdu as basically the intellectual figurehead of the Arabi uprising. But anyway,
so Abdu is not himself averse to politics, but it's the intrigue I mentioned that Afghani seems to have gotten directly involved.
I mean, what one can say is, at least in later life, he increasingly became disillusioned with intrigue and came to feel that collaboration with the colonial powers was the way forward in terms of advancing reform of society and government.
Right. If you can't beat
now,
them,
yeah, I mean, and this is another aspect in which, Abdu's in the post-independence period, anyone who collaborates with colonial powers kind of falls under a cloud. So Rida also, I guess, tries to de-emphasize this element.
Not to defend that sort of collaboration, but I think that history teaches us that these choices aren't necessarily straightforward in the moment.
Yeah, of course.
So that's important to bear in mind.
Yeah, I mean, I hate colonialism as much as anyone else, but there is room for more charitable reading of what Abdu was doing. And you can say that his agenda never changed. It's just strategy that changed. That's
Right.
Because anyway.
So I was curious about the Freemasonry dimension of this, because that you hear it, and these are accusations. There were also accusations. I mean, I think was it Eli Kaduri who, in a rather scurrilous passage.
Kaduri, I should really mention, because Kaduri, if you like, takes this, this kind of problem of contradiction to the next level, and it uses the Abdu Afghani correspondence, in particular this famous or infamous line where Abdu says, "You must behead, religion, or religion can only be beheaded with the sword of religion." Kaduri writes an essay, basically accusing. I don't think it's been widely accepted at all, accusing both Afghani and Abdu of being kind of crypto-atheists who just instrumentalize Islam for political and anti-imperialist reasons. Now, I mean,
it's that sort of stuff is drawn on by...
Some version of that argument is more defensible, I think, in the case of... I mean, Afghani was just such a mysterious figure, right? I mean, he goes everywhere, intrigues everywhere, dying under intelligence watch in Istanbul in 1897. Abdu doesn't eulogize him, so they've really fallen out by that point. And just, is this intriguer and hated by the British wherever he goes, certainly. And there's just this very mysterious figure. I mean, I don't know who would play him in the movie, but, maybe a browned-up Christopher Walken or something, because there's this kind of intriguing line. Of course, that wouldn't really work in the modern period. They'd have to cast the Iranian or something. But yeah.
But in terms of as far as I recall, some of this might be attributable to Cromer as well, like passages in his memoirs or something like this. But claiming that Abdu actually, said things to the effect that, look, I don't believe in any of this stuff either. And,
Yeah, I mean, of course, he's a biased witness. I can't remember whether it's Cromer, and this isn't mentioned in the book, but either Cromer or Blunt think that Abdu is an agnostic. But
Right.
I mean, if we're not taking Rida's account of him at face value, why should we take Cromer's? And frankly, I trust Cromer as far as I can throw him, which is to say, not far at all. I mean, and anyway.
But specifically on the Freemasonry, what did that imply at that moment?
I
Freemasonry.
mean, Rida confirmed that. Rida confirmed that they were both Freemasons. I think he says that they subsequently left, or at least Abdu subsequently left. Now, of course, the study of Freemasonry is, a whole discussion in itself. There's that kind of popular book. Gosh, I forget the author. He's an Italianist. who wrote a kind of popular work on Freemasonry that's really useful. I mean, it's this, they present themselves as having this ancient lineage, and they're tied to the construction of Solomon's Temple and the Knights Templar and what have you. But it's really an Enlightenment movement that stresses the brotherhood of man in the kind of non-sectarian sense. I mean, they sort of, the framing is theistic, or at least able to embrace followers of different religions. Right. So from the 1860s onwards, Oliver points out, they actually open up to native membership, so Egyptians can join. But I actually don't think that's really important for Afghani. Afghani just sees it as a means of intriguing. Okay. Because so many elites belong to Freemasonic lodges, even in the Muslim majority world, that it's a kind of ideal avenue for mobilizing people, elites at least politically. But of course, in the Arab world, sorry?
Abdu's engagement with it is even more short-lived, as far as I understand.
Yeah, that's my sense. I mean, a lot of, at least the claim of this book I read some years ago, I'm frustrated. Something Dickey, I think is the name of the author, maybe. Maybe you can look this up with Emma. It's like a popular Dickey, I think is the surname, I.E., ending I.E.
Yeah, John Dickey.
John Dickey, so I did remember the name.
It's called The
Craft. Yeah, so this is a really good, intellectual, respectable overview. I mean, he suggests that most of the tropes we find, for example, in the Arab world about Freemasonry, and even a fatwa of Lajna al-Da'im, I seem to remember, saying it's like this conspiracy and so on. This really emerges from tropes that Catholic polemicists develop in the late 19th century, and the Nazis kind of pick up on as well and spread to the Middle East and the Muslim majority world. So I mean, I'm not a historian of Freemasonry or anything like that. But this book is useful.
I just want to say, I mean, we're probably going to wrap up quite soon. So if anyone has any burning questions,
I mean, if we could have maybe until the end of the hour, that would be nice. But I don't know what your
my circumstances might not make that very practical.
I mean, because I still don't feel I've said enough about Oliver's.
I'm sure.
Oliver's great book.
So let's try and. I just wanted to say to viewers, and we have actually 14 people watching this right now. So, if you have any questions, let's.
Or comments.
I'm going to try and stay as long as I can, but I do have childcare duties. The other thing I would say is that I'm kind of curious. You made a couple of passing comments, and these may not have been dealt with in detail in the book, but Avicennan prophetology and remarks about Davani in particular. How can you link them back to Abdu? Were they relevant to Abdu?
So now Fazl Rahman has this book, Prophecy, Philosophy, and Orthodoxy, which is still the best. It was recently republished, or maybe in 2011, by University of Chicago Press. Still the best account of the prophetology of al-Farabi ibn Sina and the Shahrastani ibn Taymiyyah and so on. Anyway, Ibn Sina tries to present what one could call anachronistically a scientifically respectable account of prophecy, in terms of Neoplatonism and Aristotelian philosophy. The prophet is a figure of advanced intellectual and practical capacities, and he's like the founder of a society and the state and so on. Now, Rahman has discussed this better than I can. So, but what's really unique about Ibn Sina's contribution is the way he draws on the heritage of late antiquity to kind of construct this model drawn from all different kinds of elements, working up hints in Aristotle and drawing in the commentators on Aristotle and so on. And when he talks about this, he clearly has the Prophet ﷺ in mind. For example, in Risale al-Waridat, which has these very Avicennan elements, Abdu Afghani says the appearance of Gabriel alayhi salam on the horizon, early in the Prophet's career, is a rams or symbol Now, in his critique of Ibn Sina's prophetology, Ibn Taymiyyah says one of the problems with Ibn Sina is he uses Islamic terms like references to the angel Gabriel to refer to Neoplatonic concepts like the active or agent intellect, al-aql al-fa'al. And by referring to Gabriel as a Rams, Abdu stroke Afghani is clearly doing the same thing to some extent. Now, that's not really an element one finds, at least not very clearly in the Risalat al-Tawheed, but there are still Avicennan elements, partly because, Ghazali internalizes some of these things. And Griffel, he refers to the article by Griffel on Ghazali and Avicennan prophetology. Although, in his tafsir, so anyway, in his tafsir Juz Amma, though, Abdu accepts the reality of sorcery, does not deny prophetic miracles. Of course, Ibn Sina accounts for prophetic miracles in a particular way. And, he seems to kind of hew quite closely to Ash'arite orthodoxy. And, even in other respects, and there's a discussion of Abdu's fatwa on the flood of Noah and whether it's global in extent or only local. And, there is a certain studied ambiguity in Abdu's response to that question. In terms of his orthodoxy, quote unquote, again, a category that Oliver tries to problematize, I should say something about his career as a mufti from 1899. In this capacity, Abdu issues more than 1,000 fatwa, a lot of them focusing on waqf law and inheritance, which are, prime importance in his capacity as mufti. But also, Oliver discusses a number of fatwa, including the famous, or I should say infamous, 1903 Transvaal fatwa, which has been discussed a lot in the scholarship, but I'm not actually that satisfied. Maybe I just haven't read widely enough. It's discussed by Jakob Skovgaard Peterson in his book on the daughter of Egypt, and many other people have referred to it. But, in Islamic legal terms, it hasn't always been clearly explained. So I actually went back to Rida's discussion of it in Tarikh al-Ustad al-Imam, and also the original text of the fatwa, which Rida reproduces. So he's asked by a Muslim in Transvaal and South Africa 3 questions. Is it lawful to wear the European hat, the Borneta? Is it permissible to eat the meat of Ahl al-Kitab? And that needs further discussion in South Africa and Transvaal. And finally, can Shafi'is pray behind Hanafis? The answer Abdu gives to all 3 of these is yes. So Oliver says, generally speaking, Abdu's career as a mufti reflects kind of commitment to Hanafism. He was kind of restrained and constrained in this respect by his office. But on a few occasions, like the Transvaal fatwa, his agenda kind of emerges more clearly. Now, in all 3 of these respects, he was in disagreement with the conservative Azhari establishment. Why, you ask? Their argument was wearing European hats was a form of forbidden imitation or tashabbuh. The kind of authority on tashabbuh is Yusha Patel. His PhD thesis with Duke is available online, but it's actually coming out as a book early next year, I believe. Anyway, and my colleague Mohammed al-Marakibi is revising a paper now on he's found even references to the Borneta in 12th century Maghribi text, interestingly. Anyway, so that, it's a case of tashabbuh. Abdu says, no, this is just a form of national dress, and it's no different from wearing the dress of various Muslim countries. It's not a sign of religious distinction, and so on. And you can find pre-modern jurists who say, wearing like a monk's cowl or the zunar, this kind of cord, non-Muslims would, or the Dhimmis would use to distinguish themselves from Muslims. The mere act of wearing this is unbelief. That's a fairly common view. Anyway, Abdu says one's dress and the ruling on it is really a matter of intention. So that's issue number 1. issue number two, why is it problematic? Because you would think Sunni jurists generally, and again, one could complicate this by referring to the Musannaf literature. Generally speaking, Sunni jurists, as distinct from 12 Shia jurists, permit the food of Ahl-Kitab, the meat of Ahl-Kitab particularly. So why is Abdu controversial in this respect? Well, the Mustafti mentions in his ifta that, or istifta, that the Christians of the Transvaal do not mention the name of God when slaughtering. And when slaughtering cows, they first hit them with an axe and slaughter them later. So the idea is this meat is basically carrion because the animals died before being slaughtered properly, although sheep they slaughter apparently. So anyway, what is Abdu's response to this? And how does Rida also defend this? So Rida points to the disagreement among the Salaf about, what is the nature of the tasmiyah done by al-Kitab, the mention of the name of God and slaughter. So some of the Salaf held that if the non-Muslim mentions, the Kitabi specifically mentions Uzair or Jesus, then you cannot eat the meat, and Malik said it was makruh and so on. So that's one aspect of the disagreement. And citing Ibn al-Arabi, the Qadi, Abdu says, and Rida kind of follows him, they cite this fatwa of Ibn al-Arabi where he's asked about Christians who wring the necks of chickens, so they don't slaughter them, they wring their necks, and the permissibility of eating this. Ibn al-Arabi, as presented by Abdu, says, whatever Ahl al-Kitab consider permissible for themselves to eat, we consider permissible to eat. So we don't have to enter into all the details. Did they do the tasmiyah or not? What did they mention the tasmiyah? And so this is the perspective Abdu supports, but it goes against the opinion of later jurists. And finally, Hanafis and Shafi'is, common view is that why can't they pray behind each other? Because you can't be sure the Hanafi Imam has respected the rules of purity and the validity of prayer established by the Shafi'i. So out of ihtiyat, you shouldn't pray behind him. Anyway, so that's controversial, especially from 1903 onwards. Abbas Helmi II, who we've established does not like Abdu very much, kind of is involved in a propaganda campaign against him, including the publication of supposedly scarless photos, Abdu appearing with European women and so on. Anyway.
Sorry, very quick question. Yes, with respect to the mixing of madhahib, this goes back to the question of talfiq, for example. Wasn't it quite common I get the impression sometimes that in sort of post-classical Islam, it was actually common to be a bit finicky about some of this, mixing.
I remember Mulli Ali al-Harawi saying something like, only a rare griffin will be this kind of mystical bird, will be familiar with the rules of purity and prayer and all of the madhahib, and therefore be able to avoid violating them, and therefore be a valid imam for followers of different madhahib. You find both opinions. And in fact, as is well known, it's the Wahhabis who established one imamate at the Meccan Haram. Prior to that, there had been 4 mihrabs and separate prayers, and some, I know it's Rida, but people would say with outrage, you would find, and rightfully outraged, I think that you would find like the Malikis praying and Hanafis just sitting waiting for the imam to start, so they wouldn't join the prayer because of this very deeply entrenched
who praise it. I think Hamza Yusuf has a line where he says, it's part of God's providence that there were 4 madhabs because there are 4 sides to the Kaaba, right? So
but I don't know, there's just something kind of jarring for me at the Kaaba of all places.
Yeah.
And in the early period, right, the caliph is supposed to lead prayer. So what do you do? Would you not pray behind the caliph because he belongs to a different madhab? What about the Mahdi? I mean, we had an episode on Yohanan Friedman's book. Would you not pray for the Mahdi because he doesn't? Anyway, it's kind of.
Yeah, no, I mean, like some of my teachers, like Muhammad Akram Nadwi, Sheikh Akram, as we say, he once expressed complete outrage that this was ever practiced in like different schools at the Caaba. But I mean, yeah, it's interesting. I find how people frame that either as a positive or a negative. I remember Abu Amina Bilal Phillips, kind of, in a sense, he's someone who's vilifying it, and Hamza Yusuf is reacting to him and writing something like, some sort of like, I can't remember exactly how he described it, but he's saying he described it as like a shocking opinion of some modern, misguided peoples. And yeah,
I don't think it's misguided.
It's a space.
But anyway,
yeah.
So I mentioned and discussed briefly the Risala al-Waridat and the super commentary on Sharh al-Aqaid al-Adudiyya. Maybe I should say something about the major works in Abdu's last 15 years, because they've played such an important role in leading us to this notion that Abdu's contradictory and so on, and therefore in turn lead Oliver to posit this culture of ambiguity as a framework for understanding this contradiction. Anyway, so Abdu dies when Tafsir al-Manar has reached Quran chapter 4, verse 125. And he'd only revised Abdu's Rida's notes as far as the middle of Tafsir Surah Al-Baqarah, so even less. Of course, Tafsir al-Manar ends in Surah Yusuf, Surah 12. So Johanna Pink says that you can only really attribute about 15% of Tafsir al-Manar to Abdu, and even that's being mediated by Rida. But his Tafsir al-Amma is very important, and what elements does he emphasize in all of his tafsir works? He emphasizes the criticism of taqlid, which Jews, Christians, and pagans are charged with in the Quran, and its destructive elements and outcomes. So that's certainly there. And generally, Oliver says he's disinclined to the so-called tafsir ilmi, or scientific tafsir. And he emphasizes that the Quran is not a historical document or scientific treatise, but a work of guidance and moral instruction. A tendency that Oliver points out is kind of continued by the so-called Manhaj al-Adabi approach to the Quran, exemplified by, and Shuruq Naqib has written an article on this, very important article. People like Amin al-Huli, who dies in 1966, and is to an even greater extent, Ahmed Muhammad Khalafullah, who dies in 1988, and his controversial Al-Fan al-Qasasi fil Quran, where he says, even if some of the stories of the prophets are unhistorical, we can simply disregard this because this is not the point of the Quran. And one can even say, to some extent, Nasr Hamid Abu Zayd takes this to a kind of logical extreme, that the Quran is, same argument, but even more historicizing, you could say. Anyway, so there's that. And Abdu kind of, even though he might contest aspects of Ash'arism, even in the Risalat al-Tawheed, so for example, he adopts a non-Ash'ari view, kind of closer to the Maturidis and Mu'tazila on Husn and Qubuh, objective moral good, and so on. So he's an objectivist. Ash'arites are anti-realists, as Ayman Shahada would say in his important chapter in the Oxford Handbook of Islamic Theology. He kind of makes a very important intervention in how we conceptualize and understand this debate. Anyway, although Scharbrodt says in Risalat al-Tawheed that Abdu has been misunderstood as supporting a Mu'tazilite perspective on the creation of the Quran, because actually what Abdu says, in addition to mocking the Hanbali perspective on this question, he simply says that the audited Quran, al-Quran al-Masmu', is created. And according to Ash'arites as well as the Mu'tazilites, that is not a controversial position anyway. So this is interesting. So he kind of refrains from there is still this presence of Avicennan prophetology in the Risalat al-Tawheed, but you don't find.
Sorry, which element? Remind me.
Avicennan prophetology, just the whole Avicennan account of prophetology. It's about people with advanced capacities and so on. This language of emanationism is less pronounced in the Risalat al-Tawheed and so on. But the irony is that Abdu, as cited by Oliver, had said that unlike Afghani, he wasn't able to address people directly, even as detractors. He always adjusted his, or maybe not ironically, the opposite. He always addressed his message according to his audience and their expectations. As it acknowledged explicitly, he was a jurist with a jurist, philosopher with a philosopher. So that I think is really important to emphasize, these kind of intellectual continuities in Abdu's career. Is the culture of ambiguity the best way to account for them? It's certainly useful, but it does have its limitations, as we've pointed out. However, that shouldn't detract from the fact that this is, I think, a very solid, very well documented intellectual biography of Abdu that confronts the complexity of his legacy and of his oeuvre head on, without resorting to kind of facile, explanations or ways of accounting for this complexity and even contradiction. So that's kind of how I would sort of summarize the work overall.
Yeah, I mean, one other aspect of this is that, scholars like Abdu and so many scholars in the Islamic intellectual tradition are multidisciplinary in their orientation, and disciplines have their own logic and their own sort of journeys and their own trajectories through history diachronically, and they pull you in different directions very often. So, that the culture of ambiguity could be a framework that has some use. I mean, it can be misused in my view as well, but it just there's an inevitability to it, because you need to reconcile sort of pressures. I sort of have a very funny, completely irrelevant example that I could give of. So I took one of my children to the dentist the other day, and some of them had some tooth decay, and the dentist's advice was, you should have only square meals, you should have no snacking. And I was saying, I've always found it ironic.
How does anyone how does anyone live up to that?
Well, I mean, I think it's possible, but what I'd say is that doctors actually advise the reverse. They say, actually, your body is better served by having small meals throughout the day rather than having square meals. And so, how do you reconcile that? Actually, you need to live with the contradiction to a certain extent, right?
I mean, it helps that doctors frequently contradict themselves. Or at least, the popular science on diet is full of contradictions. How much water should you drink? How many...
It's not just the popular science. It's not just the popular science; it's the scholarship as well on dieting and things like that. And I think that's scholarship for you. Like the fuqaha are always disagreeing with each other, and that's why you have a discipline.
Yeah.
If it was all straightforward, you wouldn't need a discipline.
Yeah. But I kind of see what you mean. Yeah.
I sort of, my time is coming to a conclusion as well. I just maybe wanted to acknowledge some of the people who are giving salam. So 3 people, Black Viper, one of our regulars, says Assalamu alaikum wa alaikum assalam jami'an, Samina Awan as well, and someone with the title, The Thinker, says salam. So, but perhaps, Omar, we could sort of wrap up at this point, and if you have any final reflections on Oliver's book. It sounds like an extremely important contribution to a person who's been very well studied in the past, and it's nice that we have also sort of certain grooves within Islamic studies being very maturing, and other areas, of course, are virgin territory. So our field as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, indeed, Oliver begins the book by sharing the comments of his PhD supervisor, his Dr. What new can you say about Abdu? He calls him the most well-studied, probably most well-studied modern Muslim intellectual. Now, I think even those that have received a great amount of attention, I mean, in recent years, Ibn Taymiyyah, the scholarship on him, is mostly recent. I mean, or al-Ghazali, of course, you could fill a book with the bibliography of al-Ghazali and so on. I think one can still have lots of original things to say about these people. And that's no less true for Abduh. And I think Oliver succeeds in making a contribution that, I mean, he does refer to Sedgwick's biography, and Sedgwick is constrained by the limitations of this One World series. I think it's 30,000 words or 35,000 words, so he can't go into as much depth as he would like.
Right.
This is certainly in English the best intellectual biography or any kind of biography of Abduh I've read.
Right.
In terms of its comprehensiveness, its attentiveness to the sources, its engagement of the scholarship, its attempt to account for the complexity of Abduh's biographies, intellectual biography. I mean, it's a really successful, original, useful intervention that I commend to the audience.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's I guess the verdict here. Everyone go and buy it, I suppose. But we also need to add the qualification that unfortunately academic books aren't always very cheap. But borrow it at your local library to get it.
Yeah. Certainly. Yeah. So again, there's so much more I could have said. My notes were about nearly 7,000 words. And the book is, minus the notes, about 240 pages. So
yes, you wrote
there's more that could have been said.
You've written a review essay about the book, but Barakallahu fikum, Omar, as always, really wonderful insights into the book, and for informing us of or keeping us informed of the latest developments in the field. We really owe the greatest thanks to our colleague Oliver for writing such a wonderful book and such an in-depth study of an incredibly important figure in modern Islam. And I guess we should conclude, and thank you to all our viewers for sort of joining us for a nearly 2-hour session. We should conclude by highlighting that we have another book coming up in a week's time, is it? And this may be the last of our current season, shall we say? Last episode of the current season. Do you want to introduce the book, Omar, briefly? Can you...
Can you hear me clearly?
I can hear you now, yes.
Okay, good. So next week's book is, I believe, Rebellious Wives, Neglectful Husbands.
Yes.
Hopefully I haven't messed that up.
You got it right. The subtitle is Controversies in Modern Quranic Commentaries. It looks extremely exciting.
Yeah, so I'm going to have to log in again quickly because I really can't hear you. So.
Let me sort of give the title of the book. So, as Omar mentioned, Rebellious Wives, Neglectful Husbands, Controversies.
By Hadiya Mubarak.
By Hadiya Mubarak. So really looking forward to a study of, I think, 3 modern commentaries in the main, including, Al-Manar, which has been discussed today, Tahrir al-Tanwir, and Fi Dhilal al-Quran. So I'm actually very excited. I'm going to try my best to read the book, depending on my own obligations. But I look forward to your engagement with it, Omar, in a week's time. Thank you again for your time. And thank you, everyone, for joining. And until next week, inshallah, stay safe. And I look forward to seeing you. We look forward to seeing you then, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.